So, hi. All you beautiful people. Thank you, Lauralee. That was so gorgeous. So, the last couple of times I've spoken, I was talking about the sources from which Unitarian Universalism is derived. And someone noticed that we talk about the Judeo-Christian sources, but we don't talk about Islam as one of the sources. And so what I thought I would do is talk a little bit about how all of that works together, and perhaps why that has not been the case in the past. So all three of them, all three traditions, are called, each individually and collectively, the people of the book. And as I mentioned when I was talking about the Judeo-Christian tradition, in Judaism we have Torah, which is those 5 books at the beginning that tell us the story of creation and lay down the laws, and then Tanakh, which is the history of the people all the way up through the Greek takeover. And then Christianity that picks up that story with the gospel stories and gives us through Acts and Revelation the Jewish people under the Roman Empire, and particularly focusing on one man, Jesus of Nazareth. And so that brings us to about 90 of the current era. That's what CE means. It's instead of AD for all the old school folks here. And then about 660, as the Roman Empire was beginning to, well, it was thoroughly crumbled, in the Arabian states, we have the emergence of another body of material that draws heavily on the Judeo-Christian material. So in Judaism, there is a term, people of the book, HaShefer, and it refers not just to the people, but to the book itself, to Torah itself. It has a livingness about it. In Christianity, we have a number of denominations that call themselves, we are the people of the book. The Baptists and Methodists in particular came out of the access to the Bible that was following the Gutenberg press. And then later groups, the Seventh-day Adventists, many of you have heard of the Puritans, a few of you may have heard of the Shakers. All of them were very heavily dependent on the Old and New Testaments in their development. And this concept of people of the book usually is because new converts first read their own language in the Bible, because that's almost always the first thing that is translated into a written version of the language. Okay? And this is an old tradition. It goes back to when the Tibetans created a written language in order to have the Buddha Sutras. It's not unusual to do that. So many people, this is their first experience of written language, is the Bible. And they consider themselves the people of the book. And a few of you may recall that in Latin, ta Biblia is the books. All right. The Quran is the book for the folks who are in the Islamic tradition, and it really does, through the book, if you have had the opportunity to read it. If you haven't, I strongly recommend it, but don't expect chronology. You know, the first verse that was given to Muhammad, I think is Syria number 63. Okay, so they're all in different places, so don't expect a chronological unfolding. But it emphasizes this community of faith that all of these traditions share. And it really honors the moral and the religious virtues of the earlier prophets. There are stories about Jesus and Mary and Enoch and Elijah that are in the Quran that are not in the other books. And it identifies 3 groups as people of the book. One of them you've never heard of, Sabians. And a lot of scholars have tried to figure out who the people were referring to, or who Muhammad was referring to when he said Sabian. And it looks as if it is the group that are known as the Mandeans. The Mandean was one of the early heresies when Christianity was forming. You find writings about it in the early Christian church. And it's the one that says that, well, yeah, Jesus was important, but the other Simon. I'm sorry, I just lost it. John the Baptist was the real Messiah,
And Simon, the guy from the other country, was actually supposed to be his follower. And so the whole Mandean heresy is based on John the Baptist instead of Jesus. Simon the Magus. There we go. That's why I messed up on that. So those three groups. Now the Mandeans have been of concern to me for some time because in the area of the world we call Iraq, they are the swamp people who have been being eradicated, and they live around Mosul, which is the other major violent experience, shall we say, in that part of the world. So there is a real effort to not have this protected people of the book. And protected ones, dhimmi, D-H-I-M-M-I, dhimmi, is who all of the people who are not in those three groups, but are considered also acceptable within Islam. Now, why am I saying acceptable? There is clear instruction in the Quran. If someone is not following the one God and is not following the book, they must be converted or they die. So this is a problem. And so the Mandeans follow a book that is different from the Islamic book, but they follow the book. So they have been part of that world. And these are some of the other groups that have been acceptable within the Islamic State. And Babism, the Bab, actually was the precursor to Baha'i, Baha'u'llah. And Babism is an older version of that. Baha'i also is part of that. And both of them revere Torah and revere many of the Gospels and also the Quran and the material that's in there. So Baha'i has an aim for world peace. And Baha'u'llah, we have a number of people who participate in the Baha'i movement here. In North America, Baha'i is interesting because in Hopi, Baha'i means people of peace. Wow. And so there are a lot of Native Americans who are choosing to become Baha'i because it is a way they can bridge with Western culture that works for them. It's beautiful. So there are going to be 9 groups. These are the first 2 alphabetically. Druze. Most people have never heard of the Druze. They've always fascinated me because they're a lot like New Thought. Because they're including Ishmaelism and Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, Pythagorean, all of these other things to find the esoteric core. Every now and then I do a talk on the perennial philosophy, and with that core, that inner core, all of them are pretty much saying the same thing. And the Druze is trying to focus on that. There's Mandeanism again, one of the problems with Mandeanism, and I'm sure is part of why the swamp people are being given trouble, is they don't consider Abraham a prophet. He's a false prophet because he didn't follow what God told him to do. He tried to do something different, and that's why we have both Ishmael, the father of the Arabs, and Israel, the father of the Jews. Then there are the Rastafari. Yay, Bob Marley. It's interesting. It's an Afrocentric religious tradition, monotheistic. There is one God, that is Yah. And Yah is good. And Yah is encouraging the Africans to go back to Africa because that's where they will no longer be oppressed by the Europeans. And the other piece is Haile Selassie, who was the emperor of Ethiopia at that time, is considered the embodiment of that good, and possibly the second coming within the tradition of the Gospels. Yeah, so there's just wonderful dimensions of Rastafarianism that most of us don't get beyond the reggae. Many of you have heard the story of the Good Samaritan, in the Gospel. The Samaritans were the Jewish people who were not hauled away to Babylon. So they didn't get involved with the Chaldean stories and the Babylonian myth stories and that way of being. They stayed up in the hills and were separated from that whole evolution of the Judaic culture. Okay, and so when Nehemiah came back out of the that awful exile period and built the new temple, they didn't see any need for it because they continued just fine in the hills. And so in the Gospels we have two stories. One, the Good Samaritan, he's picking on the least favorite group in the Jewish tradition and saying, see, even he could be a good guy, right? Whereas all our upright Jewish people just walked on past this injured man, this guy, this Samaritan that we looked down on, he was good. That's the point of that story. And then toward the end we have him meeting a woman at the well. Because he's gone through Samaria to get through to Jerusalem, he meets a Samaritan woman at the well. And they have a conversation about the differences between Judaism as practiced around the temple and Judaism as practiced around the Samaritan folks. And believe it or not, Samaritanism is still alive. This form of Judaism that is almost nature-based, and has this book, the Mamer Marka, which is like the Tanakh in the traditional Jewish world. So that's kind of fun that that's still there, and according to, if an Arab or a Muslim encounters a Samaritan, then you're fine. Thank you. You're part of our community. Shabbatism. Shabbat may be the oldest of all the traditions in practice in the world today. It looks as if they're actually drawing on the ancient hill practices around Kurdistan, and there's that town, Mosul again, and they have been being really abused. They're technically, they say they are Shiites, but they do other things. And so for those real fundamentalist Islamic folks, it's like, no, you don't get to call yourself Muslims. So they're having some real issues around Mosul, around that. And I'm going to add in a little piece here. There was a guy in the 40s and 50s and a little into the 60s who had grown up in that part of the world, and he spoke Aramaic. And he realized that the gospel experience, everyone must have been speaking Aramaic. They weren't speaking Greek. I mean, why would Jesus stand on a hillside and speak Greek, right? He was speaking Aramaic. So all the stuff that we have in the New Testament that is in Greek first was actually spoken in Aramaic. So he went out into these communities to see if he could find anything in the original Aramaic. And he did, at Mosul. He found a parchment that had only been copied 4 times in 2,000 years. Because parchment lasts. And so it was Matthew in Aramaic. And he wrote a number of books. You can find George Lomsa, like Lama but with an S, Lomsa, in his work. He talks about the idioms of the Aramaic language. That book is Gospel Light. He talks about an alternative way of understanding both the Jewish text and the Christian text, but mostly the Christian text from that perspective. So Mosul to me is one of those core key places, and so I keep raining blessings on it, trusting that that parchment is somewhere still alive, and trusting that those folks are being able to break through this weirdness that has happened over the years, because some people have taken some passages of the Quran and treated them as if that's how everyone has to live. The last two that are part of it, this is even older, Yazdanism, also Yazidi, Yazani, and Alevi. These are the people who are from the pre-Zoroastrian Mithraic tradition up in the mountains. So they use the flame, but they're using traditions and chants and songs and ways of being together that are at least 4,000 years old and probably older. So it's beautiful that this is continuing. And you can, if you go get some YouTubes about people who are wandering around Kurdistan, sometimes you can get a glimpse of these practices. And then it turns out that Dhimmi includes the Hindu people who are practicing yoga based on the Vedas, because that's a book. And the book, there are a lot of overlaps between what's in some of the early Vedas and some of what's in the whole Judeo-Christian and Islamic books. So, and that came about when the Islamic people went in and invaded, took over India, and they did destroy almost all of the polytheistic temples. But, and I shared some of that when I was sharing my trip last spring. But they didn't destroy the people. which was a big jump for them. So there's this sense, and it's almost, for people who are aware of evangelical Christians who go, we need to change everybody into Christians, that you may be able to tap into, that's what's going on there. But it's from that 12th century of bodies don't matter, souls are what matter, and that's what they're talking about. So if we are a dhimmi in an Islamic state, we have equal rights as far as property, as far as contracts, and as far as our obligation to the community goes. However, because we are not followers of the Quran, we do not have to do specific things that the Quran assigns Muslims to do. We don't have to fast during Ramadan. We don't have to give to the poor at the same rate, etc. And in the Islamic states, of course, if you are following Quran, you have political rights that other people don't have. So that's part of what happens in all the Islamic states. And then finally, you're generally encouraged to remain in your own community. So the Jews are over here, the Christians are over here, the Zoroastrians are over here, whoever. And to keep their own courts and decision-making around social issues, or if there are property violations that are outside of the larger law. You have your own courts. So there's a rabbinical court, there's a Christian court, etc. So this is what happens when dhimmi people are in an Islamic state. Now, if we have Muslims and Christians in Israel, the only Judaic state right now, we have equal under the laws of property, contract, and obligation, excluded from specific duties that are assigned to Jews. We don't have to fast on Yom Kippur. We don't have to attend in the temple, in a synagogue, or what's remaining of the temple at the Wailing Wall. There are things that we don't have to do because we, if we're not Jewish in the Jewish state, and there are certain political rights that only Jews in Israel can have, that no Christians or Muslims can do. Again, because we're not following the laws and the traditions of the Talmud and Torah. In Christian states, in the modern Christian states, everybody's equal and everyone has equal rights. So this is an interesting difference that is hard for people in those other states to grasp. Okay? Now, a number of Muslim immigrants to this country don't realize that they have equal political rights. A lot of them don't realize that that there is no distinction based on the religious tradition. Some of the Jewish immigrants, remember, many of you have grandparents who were Jewish immigrants, and it never occurred to them that they could vote, right? They had to learn that it was okay to be part of the decision-making of this country. So these are traditions that are, thousands of years old, or at least over 1,000 years old, that are undone in a non-religious or non-religion established country. And so we need to pay attention to that the expectations where the country, the government and the religion are one, are different from places like ours where the religion and the government are separate. All right, so those are some of the structural things. These are some of the points on which we all agree. Okay, we all agree in essence that the nature of God is, there is one. Now, there's some disagreements, and we'll talk about that in a minute, on the specifics of that, but in general, we all agree of this. We all agree that Abraham is the father. Okay, Abraham had 2 children, 2 boys, Ishmael and Jacob, and then Jacob became, Ishmael and Isaac, and then Isaac had Jacob and Esau, and Jacob becomes Israel, and his 12 sons become the 12 tribes, all right? And Abraham has Ishmael. When Isaac is born, Isaac's mom, Abraham's actual wife, says, I know I told you to have a son by my concubine, my handmaiden, to take her on as your concubine, but, now we have our own son. We don't need him. And so she literally kicked the mother and the son out of the camp. and sent them off. And this is one of the reasons that Islam has a little bit of upset with the Judeo-Christian tradition, because to them that is as real as if it had happened to their father or grandfather. Okay? We're talking 4,000 years ago. But that is what is real in that world. There isn't a sense of linearity of time. It's a cyclical time, and this is real. So that Ishmael was kicked out, but he was saved by the angels. They showed him water, they showed them, brought them food, and they were brought to community who could help them become safe and help him grow up. Revelation through prophets. Every single one of these traditions says that the words in the book came from a prophet, and that prophet was hearing God speak through them, and they were writing it down, what God said. This is absolutely consistent across all three books, and it's why in Islam the other groups, the Judeo-Christian groups, are considered people of the book, because it's all revealed from God. Okay? Both the Jewish people and the Islamic people have food restrictions based on the Bible. In the Judaic world it's kosher, in the Arabic world it's halal. They're very, 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 very similar, including how to kill an animal to eat it. Okay? There are some very minor differences, and one of them is the Islamic tradition spends some focus on how the animal is raised. Was it raised in a loving environment? In the Judeo tradition, that's assumed. Right? But in the Arabic world at the time, they were separate. The idea that you could be as abusive to an animal as you liked, and nobody would think against that. But in the Judeo world, when Torah was established, no one would be abusive to an animal. So it's kind of interesting to see that. All of them, all three, say there is an afterlife, and that there will be end times. And interestingly, all of the end times are the same as all the indigenous prophecies. The world ends in fire. Okay? So the world in most understandings is the way we are living today ends in fire, and then all souls can go on to a heavenly life, whatever that is. And then finally, all three agree on the sacredness of Jerusalem. Now, I'm going to see if we can make this link work, and then give you a little bit of a video. Yes, but we got an ad for Downton Abbey first.
For almost a century, Arabs and Jews have fought for control of the Holy Land.
I'm working on it.
Jerusalem is sacred to all three monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And here, politics and religion are profoundly linked. All three religions associate the city with their core beliefs. So how do those who live here cope with this tense situation? For Christians, Jerusalem is the city where Jesus was crucified and rose from the dead. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is built on the site where these events are believed to have happened. For Jews, Jerusalem is the holy city that God has given them. The Western Wall is all that remains of the Second Temple, destroyed by the Romans almost 2,000 years ago. Where the temple once stood, Al-Aqsa Mosque now rises into the heavens. After Mecca and Medina, this site in Jerusalem is the holiest in Islam. The Dome of the Rock is built on the spot where Mohammed is believed to have ascended into heaven. In the Old walled city, which covers less than 1 square kilometer, the three religions live side by side in clearly defined districts. All three view Abraham as their father, and they all believe in the same God. But there are differences. There's also the political dimension. In 1967, Israel occupied East Jerusalem. And it's here that a mountain of contention lies, the elevation that the Jews call Temple Mount and Muslims Al-Haram al-Sharif.
We are struggling politically to run our boat and to get the most validity from all the different countries, Europeans, America, etc. Because we have the Arabs nation against us, but we know, so we always feel it, and we always have our finger on pulse.
The Jewish state is trying to have all the cake for their own self, their self. This is difficult. This might make some wars.
That's the hard part right there, right? So, because there is this assumption that it's not, that everybody needs to have access to this, there is this constant tension. Now, that has not always been the case. During the time when the Islamic Empire controlled what we call the Holy Land, including the city of Jerusalem, everyone had equal access because we were all people of the book. There was no question about it. But at one point, and there are a number of thoughts about this, my personal thought is the Pope didn't like having a lot of knights running around Europe without something to do. And so he decided that, Christians needed to control the Holy Land. And so he rounded up all the knights in Europe and created the First Crusade to take over and, claim the Holy Land for Christianity. And that began the process, and that was 1,000 years ago, and that began the process that we're still dealing with today. It was sort of kind of settling back into a comfort level along about the turn of the last century, along about the 1900s. The Ottomans had taken over, and again, everyone had access. But then World War I happened, and there was a new incredible technology that was based on oil. And the Treaty at Versailles carved up the Middle East and the Ottoman Empire and created borders where there had never been borders before. And now there was, again, what is going on here, who owns what. And then after World War II, because of the incredible things that have been happening to the Jewish people during, and preceding World War II, then a piece of land was carved out for Israel as a state, without negotiating. The Europeans did this, they just imposed it, without negotiating with the local people about, well, there are Palestinian families that have been living in this area for centuries, and but we think it belongs to these people who no longer have a home, and so that tension began to be very, very extreme at that time. And what began to happen is now beginning to be undone, thank heavens, and that is those walls, those ideas that these people want this and these people want this and they can't have it and no, was beginning to break down. And Rabbi David Schwartz in Ashland is one of the many people who is working with imams and leaders on the Muslim sides in that part of the world and getting kids, teenagers especially, to hang out together and discover how much we have in common across these traditions. And there are still some major differences, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about those. And one of those is the idea of end times and the Messiah. Okay? The Jewish Messiah is not a god, it's a mortal man. David was about as mortal as they come.
But he is holy in the sense that he is connected with the divine. He stays in that joyous place as much as he can. He feels God's presence. And so then as he appears, what we have is a different kind of world emerging, because God is alive and expressed and experienced in this person. In Christianity, we say the Messiah already came once and he's coming back. Almost all of the European countries are based on that assumption, that particular form of there is a time when everything is going to be just fine, all right? And putting an end to this world, establishing heaven on earth. And a lot of what's going on in Israel over the last 20, 30 years has been Christians trying to get all the Jews in Israel, in the whole world, so that the temple will be rebuilt, so that the second coming can happen, so we can have heaven on earth. So if you watch some of the traditional Christian shows, you'll see advertisements asking for money to get more Jewish people to move into Israel. From Ethiopia, from Russia, from other countries around the world. And that's what they're aiming for. As soon as that place is filled and completely Judaic, then the second coming will happen, because that's their understanding of what the Tanakh, the Old Testament, and the New Testament say. Now the Islam, they're expecting Jesus to come back too, but not as God, because there is only one God, and at the same time, someone called Mahdi is going to show up. And Jesus will come back as a spiritual presence, as a prophet, the way Elijah is said to have come back. And Mahdi is going to be the one that turns the world into a God-centered community. So that's the difference in those areas. More fundamentally, Jesus the Nazarene in Islam is another wonderful prophet, and there's some wonderful miraculous stories around him, just as there are around all prophets. All right? In Christianity, there's a whole other world there. In the Quran, it says, Allah is one God and Allah never begets. In Christian, Jesus is the only begotten Son of God. So we have this fundamental difference about who he can be and what that means. And that, if we have a wonderful prophet who performs miracles, that's something that, is understandable to the humanistic mind. But if we have someone that is somehow God incarnate, who can be the only one who can do this stuff, then that doesn't work. And so that's one of the differences. In Muhammad, the attitude toward Muhammad, Jews and Christians tend to think of this as, he was a camel driver in the Arabic states, and he was able to get in touch with the one God that we all are in touch with, if you're in any of these traditions. And he was able to lead and unite his people to understand that and live from that. Okay? Much of the Quran is guidance to him on what to tell people when they come to him and say, oh, this is happening, what are we going to do? And so he goes in and he gets the guidance and he comes back, and it's written down by people who are listening to him. And a lot of that is, you are being persecuted, this is what you do when you're being persecuted. A huge amount of the Quran is that. So if someone attacks you, you can do this. If they don't attack you, you can't do that. All right? Well, the story among many people in the Islamic world right now is that we, particularly the United States, have been attacking them for a very long time. And so their understanding is that it's perfectly okay to attack us. However, there are many, many, many people in Islam, Islam, by the way, means Isalam, Shalom, people of peace. All right? And the people who are inclined to that way of thinking see that and know that. And one of my favorite stories is there's a cleric in Yemen who heard about these kids who were tying bombs to themselves, right? And if that one had gotten caught and was in jail for, about to do that, he would go in and sit down with them with the Quran and say, show me where here it says you can do what you did. And they would say, well, I'm told Surah 20, whatever, and he'd go, okay, let's look at this. And he would read that verse, and he would read it in the context of the other verses, and they would go, wow, I had no idea. He managed to transform the lives of dozens, maybe hundreds of people, doing that over about a 20-year period, and he's not the only one doing that. So we need to recognize that there are people in all of these traditions that are much more aware of the similarities and that core commonality than these final things. So if we look at the fact that each one of these comes from a different understanding and has different expectations, maybe we can remember that at the core we care, all right? We all have that same core. Jews expect all non-Jews to continue to persecute them, and I hate to say that, but if I read the prayers, and I do, that's what it says. We have been persecuted, we are being persecuted, we expect to be persecuted. That's the expectation, it's not the desire, but it's built into the prayers of the Jewish tradition, all right? The expectation is until all Jews live in Zion, all right? And the Messiah comes, the temple is restored, and the whole world can be ruled by God in God's love, all right? It's part of the Judeo tradition to have that goal. And we hear that particularly in Passover. All of you attended a Seder at which we ended with next year in Jerusalem.
Right.
Every year. Yeah. The Christians expect the world to accept Jesus Christ as a personal Savior and Protector, because that's the only way they're ever going to experience the heavenly world, until He comes back as God's right hand to judge the living and the dead. Some of you remember that language. And abolish evil, establishing God as the ruler of heaven and earth. That's what that whole book of Revelation is about, the war between the good and the evil, and of course evil is abolished, and now we can experience heaven on earth. And that's what gets many people into the movement, into that way of thinking. That's what we all, in our hearts, want. We want no more evil, right? We want a life that is good for all beings, and that is sort of woven into the Quran end times as well. And the Muslims expect everyone in the world to proclaim one God and to live by the book. Preferably the Quran, but if you can't do the Quran, do Tanakh, Torah, Old Testament Gospels, some version of the book.
Any of the books that you
Right. Any of these books are acceptable. Remember, they're the three, the Judeo-Christian and Muslim traditions are all the one book, and all these other traditions, these 9 other traditions, are their own book. And it's okay, because it has these fundamental moral expectations, these fundamental religious traditions that are common across them. Of course, we are all evolving. We are becoming who and what we truly are. Of course, we're all getting into the core. So one of the things that Unitarian Universalism offers is an interesting bridge, because there are some Christians who have a hard time not believing there are actually 3 gods. One called Jesus, one called Father, and one called Spirit, Holy Spirit. In their minds, it's not one showing up in whatever form is appropriate. It is actually 3 different beings, all right? That's hard on a Muslim. Because we have to accept there is one. And in the Judeo tradition, we have very early on repeated over and over, Shema, O Israel, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. And the fundamental verse of the Quran is, hear ye people, Allah your God is one. All right? Guess what Unitarian means? So, we are a bridge. We are a way where people can be comfortable from whatever tradition they come. We are recognizing place, an accepting place, where even though some of these expectations are different, even though some of these interpretations are different, even though some of these ways of applying these ideas are different, we recognize that at the core, it's all the same. It's all one. I was in a group the other day, and she was from a Christian family, and she had been dating this Arab, his wonderful Islamic person, and the family wanted her to go to church, and she wanted to be with him, and she was feeling torn. And he says, "Oh, go to church. It's all the same God." Yeah, and that's where we are. Thank you so much.